Okay. Hey, Rob. How are you? Hi, Dave Phelps. Nice to see you here. And hi, Dee Hagalaz. Great to see you here too. Thank you for coming. Is my sound all right? By the way. And hi, Daniel Lindbergh, I guess it is. A famous name, but not spelled in quite the same way. Oh, thanks, Rob. That's what I needed to know. Okay, so the internet is alive with all kinds of articles and commentaries about the Bernie criticism Sanders of the media, the mainstream media. Okay, of course, and of course the mainstream media has been pushing back on Bernie. They've been pushing back something fierce. They've been pushing back on MSNBC, and they've been pushing back on CNN, and the Washington Post, of course, is pushing back, and they're all screaming, "What, me? Is it possible that I am biased? Is it possible?" So, of course, the Bernie forces are hitting back too. And there was a very good article by Norman Solomon, who's connected to the Bernie Sanders campaign, by the way, but was also a very good writer. I've been reading his stuff for quite a long time, and I think he's very truthful. And he's written an article. I'm not sure where it originally appeared, uh, but where I picked it up was in Truth Dig, and it was published just yesterday on August 14th. The title of it is Bernie Sees Right Through the Washington Post. And the article starts by referring to the media critic George Seldes, who many decades ago has observed, quote, "No sacred cow, the press is the press itself." And Norman agrees and says that remains true today. Then he talks about the context of it, which was when Bernie spoke to a crowd in New Hampshire this past week and talked about the tax avoidance, okay, of Amazon, which, by the way, did not pay any federal income tax last year. So Bernie went on to say, "I wonder why the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon. I wonder why they don't write particularly good articles about me," he says. "I don't know why, but I guess maybe there's a connection," unquote. So Solomon fills in the context and mentions that Bernie fought explicitly and effectively to raise the wages of Amazon workers as well, okay, as millions, okay, of others. And he says, and yet the mass media pretense is that the financial interests of the Post's owner have no effect on the newspaper's coverage, okay, of Sanders. Then he points to the denial by the media, the corporate media, and says that but their denial is the name of the game. He says, but there's nothing usual about Bernie Sanders, who's been willing to call out the biases and blind spots of corporate media since he came into politics, which was, I guess, for the first time way back in the 1970s. For his latest transgression, Sanders earned authoritative pushback from the likes of the top editor of the Washington Post. Also, it's a columnist on the media and others with very high media visibility. And the Post executive editor, Mr. Martin Barron, declared, quote, contrary to the conspiracy theory the senator seems to favor. But Jeff Bezos has allowed our newsroom to operate with full independence, as our reporters and editors can attest, unquote. The media columnist of the Post, Margaret Sullivan, quickly chimed in with a harmonizing tweet on Tuesday defending her editor boss and the owner of the paper. And she said, quote, I've never seen or heard a hint of Jeff Bezos interfering in Washington Post coverage. And then some more of the media chimed in. CNN's Chris Cillizza, who cited his work at the newspaper for a decade, prior to his work at CNN, indignantly wrote, quote, for the last 3 of my years at the Post, Bezos owned the company, but not once in all that time. And he says, I wrote a number of pieces a day on politics and politicians, including Sanders and Trump, over that time. Was there even a whiff of Bezos' influence in the newsroom? But not once in all that time. He says, I wrote a number of pieces a day on politics and politicians. And Solomon goes on to say, all Barron or Sullivan would need to do to disprove their own current claims would be to write a bunch of pieces denouncing the man who owns the Post and see what happens due to their breach of required censorship. And he says, on television, an anchor at CNN joined with USA Today columnists to claim that Sanders' criticism of the Post coverage was free of evidence. So here I want to introduce, a question, which is, what kind of evidence would we accept as somehow proving the contention of the newspapers that there was no bias in the coverage, the newspapers and also the media. In other words, what evidence would we accept? Their coverage has been practically uniformly negative on Sanders. Sanders has a national approval rating. I forget exactly what it is. It's somewhere in the 50s or low 60s, at this point. It's way above the disapproval rating that he has. I think his balance is something like 27 points. So the polling shows that he's approved of by a majority of the American people. In matchups against Trump, he's often the victor in polling by 7 points or 8 points or even 10 points. Okay, sometimes the margin is smaller. But in only one poll this year has Trump actually been first when matched up with Sanders, and that by a single point. There's something like 25 polls 25 polls that show Sanders is eminently electable against Trump. Now that's also true for Joe Biden, but it's true for Sanders, okay, as well. He's a lot more popular, okay, than Trump, but that's not really the point. Okay, the point is he's very popular with the American people at large in terms of his approval rating. So why is it that there are no mainstream writers who have very much to say about Sanders that is positive? Why is it that they are so at variance with the opinions of the American people at large? Okay. Are we to believe that their wisdom is so great compared to the rest of the American people that they cannot occasionally produce an article or a post which is reasonably favorable to Sanders without the snide asides or various other condemnations or the outright smears that we see from them continuously? In other words, what kind of evidence do we need that the media is biased other than their behavior towards Bernie Sanders and the fact that they never write any favorable articles? You'd be extremely hard pressed to find any favorable articles. We can't get into the minds of the media. All we can do is judge whether the media is biased by the behavior of the media. Now, it's well known that at one time, the Washington Post in 2016, but during the race, okay, with Hillary Clinton, the Washington Post actually produced 16 negative articles in 24 hours against Bernie Sanders. Not a single positive article from anybody. They have no writers for the Post that have a good thing to say about Bernie Sanders. They don't have too many writers at the Times. I don't know if they have none, but certainly the overwhelming opinion at the Times is also not pro-Sanders. Not even Krugman is approving to Bernie Sanders. I mean, he's okay on Biden. He appears to favor Senator Warren, but I've never seen him write anything favorable to Bernie Sanders. There is no columnist at that paper. There's no writer for that paper that writes a positive thing about Bernie Sanders. The same is true at CNN. Recently, okay, at MSM, NBC, we saw that one of their paid panelists, a lady by the name, of Mimi Roca, declared on a panel without any evidence, or really without any argument. She simply delivered the opinion on the panel. Bernie Sanders, he makes my skin crawl. Meanwhile, by her side sat another lady with a little bit of a smile on her face. The other lady's name was Zerlina Maxwell, who's a veteran of the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, who has had a string of editorial statements this year when she goes on to MSNBC that are extremely negative on Bernie Sanders. A string of editorial statements this year. Anyway, to go on and on with this. That are extremely negative on Bernie Sanders. So Norman Solomon says, so Barron, Sullivan, Saliza, and countless other employees of corporate media are well paid while publicly maintaining their denial in the service of corporate power. So with the virtues of the Washington Post on parade, Emperor Bezos must be decked out in the journalistic finery of his new clothes, even when the self-interest and implications of the leverage of the billionaire over media are stark but naked. Solomon goes on to point out that Bernie never said that this was a, quote, conspiracy, unquote. He said the problems are much deeper and more pernicious. I think he said, to go further than Solomon, that the problems with the media were systemic. And Solomon says, having to do with the financial structures of the media institutions that enable the magnates who are profit-driven and enormous corporations to dominate the flow of news and commentary. Now that, folks, is certainly a true statement. We see it every day. The Post's Mr. Barron is ill-positioned to defend his newspaper against charges of anti-Sanders bias. Such bias has been profuse, and it began well before a pivotal moment in the 2016 campaign on the eve of the high-stakes primary in Michigan in early March. Then, as fair analyst Adam Johnson showed, the Washington Post ran 16 negative stories on Bernie Sanders in 16 hours, quote unquote. I'm sorry, okay, I aired earlier. I said it was in 24 hours. But evidently, Adam Johnson, after his analysis, showed that it was over a 16-hour period. One negative article per hour. So Solomon then says, this year the Post has strained to throw negative light on Sanders' campaign, whether focusing on Wall Street or Venezuela. Nor is the Post far afield from other powerful media outlets. For example, the New York Times has taken Sanders to task for various alleged sins, such as desiring to exercise control over his own campaign and failing to please Democratic critics who are actually lobbyists for the corporations, but are not identified as such. Nor is the AT&T owned CNN far afield from the baseline of cable news giants that supposedly provide a liberal alternative to the odious Fox News coverage from MSNBC, owned by Comcast, quote, the world's largest entertainment company, unquote, has provoked one assessment after another, documenting the network's anti-Bernie bias. Quote, the corporate owned and corporate advertiser funded media of this country are the biggest barriers between Bernie Sanders and the Oval Office. I wrote 5 months ago, says Solomon. Quote again, often functioning as propaganda outlets, the major news media serve as an amplification system for corporate power that has long shielded the Democratic Party from the combined threats of social movements and also progressive and populist candidates, unquote. And then Solomon reveals, I continue to actively support Sanders. And then he goes on to say, journalists who have staked their careers on remaining in the good graces of corporate employers are certainly inclined to say in public that the billionaire owners and huge corporations don't constrain their journalistic work. And in their minds, they might be telling the truth. As George Orwell wrote, quote, circus dogs jump when the trainer cracks his whip, but the really well-trained dog is the one that turns his somersault when there is no whip, unquote. So I got a couple of things to say about that as well. And by the way, that's the ending of the article. What would you expect the corporate employers, or I should say, okay, the employees, the journalists, who have staked their careers on remaining in the good graces of their employers, what would you expect them to say in public concerning whether the huge corporations and the billionaire owners constrain their journalistic work? They want you to believe that they're unbiased, that it's all coming out of their heads. What would you expect them to say? And by the way, what has happened to people who have said anything different? Well, that's my second point of commentary here. What has happened to people who have said anything different? Okay. What happened to Crystal Ball recently when she got a little obstreperous at NBC, okay, at MSNBC? She was soon replaced as a columnist. What happened to Ed Schultz when he got into a conflict with Phil Griffin, the president, okay, of MSNBC, when he wanted to cover the Sanders campaign? What happened to him? They bought out his contract. Cost them a lot of money, by the way. But to silence him, they bought out his contract. He showed up later on RT, where he swore that there was no editorial interference. But How did Ed Schultz get into conflict with Phil Griffin? By wanting to cover the Sanders campaign in 2016. But how did Ed Schultz get into conflict with Phil Griffin? And what happened to Phil Donahue back in, was it 2002 or 2003? When he began to comment on the Iraq War? And what happened to Phil Donahue? Phil Donahue had among the highest ratings, was fired by his network, and his career virtually ended because he said things that the owners did not want him to say. And what happened to Cenk Uygur, the young Turk himself? Didn't he get fired because he said too much? Okay, on MSNBC? He did. Then he went on to start Justice Democrats and the Young Turks. And now the Young Turks are challenging the cable news stations for views and for coverage. But Cenk got his contract. His contract, okay, was bought out as well. And what happened to Keith Olbermann? They spent a fortune to buy his contract out because they didn't like the commentary that they thought was too vituperative and too critical of the Bush administration. All of these people I've mentioned were either headliners or close to headliners. And what happened to Dylan Ratigan? I mean, what happened to, Dylan Ratigan when he went on a famous rant about how things were rigged in the media? And what happened to Dylan Ratigan? And how things were rigged in the parties? What happened to, Dylan Ratigan when he went on a famous rant about... He was quickly fired after that as well. He embarrassed everybody by telling the truth. And how things were rigged in the parties. Now, all of these are people that I agree with sometimes and that I disagree with, okay, and other times. I don't think, okay, that any of them were very left. Certainly not as lefty as Bernie Sanders is. They were far more centrist. And they are far more centrist still today. And yet, the networks would not allow them free speech. Now, what happens? What happens to the current people who are on the networks? They know all these other people who had to leave because they spoke too freely. So by now, the people who remain at the networks are conditioned people who know how far they can go. And who, in interest of their careers, now are careful to stay on the right side of the commentary and not to say anything that the owners and top level managers will find too controversial. To stay on the right side of the commentary and not to say anything. That's the evidence. That's the evidence that suggests too controversial. That the people on mainstream cable news are constrained in what they can say, cannot speak their minds, and to find favor with their employers, are constrained to have a negative bias against Bernie Sanders. And if they know what's good for their careers, they will exhibit that kind, of bias. When you add the examples of the people who got fired to the record of the behavior of what comes out of the media, the mainstream media, it seems to me that any reasonable person has to conclude that there is bias there. There is bias there. And there's a total disconnect with what a majority of people in this country think about Bernie Sanders. So, anyway, that's what I have to say about it right now. I'm now ready to consider commentary from you and questions from you, which I hope to see a lot of. Anyway, that's what I have to say about it right now. I'm now ready to consider commentary from you and questions from you. So, but Randy Hedgebeth is here, and Byron Montgomery has joined, and Peter Lutrario. Hi, Peter. I hope I got your name right. And my daughter Devora has joined. Hey, Devora, nice to see you. And also Dolores Piers. Hi, Dolores. It's great to see you too. And Rob says TYT is garbage. Once Kansenberg invested $20 million into the company, they've gone full MSNBC light. Well, maybe so, but they still seem to be more or less for Sanders. Of course, with a good dash of Warren thrown in. Rob says, as far as Keith Olbermann, I have no idea. I think worms ate his brain, and they're now occupying the interior of his skull. I have a similar opinion about Keith. Okay, at this point, he's certainly changed over time. I think he got bought out of his contract for something like $30 or $35 million, but he had to shut his mouth for years. Literally, he had to shut his mouth for years. So I guess he decided after that, well, maybe he didn't care to build, another political presence, because he knew that if he tried to do it on the media channels, he would not be able to say what he wanted to say. And Rob says, most of the bias comes from issues of class. Well, sure. I mean, it does. All of the panelists and the anchors who are on the media channels just want to stay there, and in a few years, they're in the millionaire category. I mean, even the very young ones who did not start out in that way. They would love to spend 10 years there, because they know they're set for the rest of their lives if they can just hang in for 10 years or so. Look how people like Rachel Maddow were changed. their opinions were changed. The orientation of their programs was changed. Chris Hayes. Chris Hayes used to be a respectable New York lefty not too many years ago. Then he got a program, okay, on MSNBC. Then he got an evening program at 9 o'clock, okay, on MSNBC. And now he's very cautious about the questions he asks and what he has to say and the guests that he has on. Rob says the media has a narrative to protect or sell themselves, okay, to project or sell themselves. Corporations and capitalism is wonderful. Sure, there are mishaps, but everything is great. And Rob says they've been bought and merged, so it's easier to manage the entire marketing propaganda. Yes, I certainly agree with that, Rob. Any other statements or comments? Okay, if you want to provide some, but please do that, because if not, I'm going to move on to the second stream of the night. Hey, there's Andres Bernal. Hi, Andres. How are you? Great to see you. Rob said, these journalists can't press politicians or they'll be getting a call from their CEO to shut up or get fired. Well, we know that's what happened in some of the cases. We certainly do know that. Okay. Anything else any of you would like to add? If not, anything else any of you would like to add? Then please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at the link shown. Please share, like, and subscribe. And please become a patron at the link shown. And please tune in to my second stream. That one is going to be on modern money theory, actually. I'm going to be going over some thoughts, okay, of by J.D. Alts. Some thoughts about how to explain to people that the Treasury Department can always trade the future reserves that it can issue for reserves that it is able to deficit spend. So I'll be talking about that in the second of my streams. And Rob says, you think there's going to be a recession? Mike Norman says there's but there's no recession. Rob says, I happen to believe there isn't one, but either for many reasons. Well, it seems as though there's a recession In Germany, perhaps the first quarter of the year there, okay, was negative. News will soon be coming out about the second quarter of the year. If that is also negative, then there's going to be an official recession there. And certainly that's going to hurt their trade with ourselves. Okay, and that also may have an impact. Of course, the Chinese economy has also slowed down, and their trade with us is harmed, okay, by what Trump is doing. So there definitely are some hiccups in the situation. I'd like to see Mike's argument. I think that Bill Black recently did a piece for the Real News where he talks about the recession signs. So I have to check in on that piece and see what Bill has to say. I felt, though, Rob, for a long time that there are asset bubbles that can threaten the financial solvency of the banks again, and under certain circumstances, having to do with the incompetence of the Trump officials, but it could lead to another crash. And Rob says, "Can I invite Mike Norman on the show to talk about the state of the economy?" Yeah, I certainly can invite him on the show if he'd like to come. So I will tell him. I guess there's one thing I do have to do. Since my shift over to XSplit, I haven't actually tried to do an interview yet, and I'll have to test out if I can actually do that. I should be able to. It might be good, Rob, if you could join me for a test, and at that point, okay, I'll check out if the software works and without any glitches, and then I can certainly have Mike on. So, okay, any other comments or questions? If not, okay, I'll get off, okay, at this point and see you perhaps in 10 minutes or so for my second stream of the night. Okay, give me 10 and I'll be back. And thanks for coming, by the way. Please remember to share, like, and subscribe. And if you're so inclined and you like my content, please go to my Patreon account. Thank you.